Right, hello. Welcome to my video on Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, chapter 7. I guess if you're watching this, it's because you're probably doing GCSE and want a little bit of help with it. I'm just going to talk you through the chapter. I'm going to read through it and keep pausing to kind of update you as to what's going on, so you're clear as to what's happening. Okay. So the first thing is the chapter 7 is called The Incident at the Window, which is significant because it suggests that there's a particular event that's happening, hence the word incident. And it brings us back to what we discussed earlier in the novel about the fact it becomes kind of like a police statement. And because incident is quite a formal word, and it suggests that there's something that quite significant that happened at the window. We've talked about the importance of windows before, with the idea of that the eyes are supposed to be the windows to the soul. We've talked about the back of Dr. Jekyll's house, where Mr. Hyde normally resides, as having no windows, or the windows are very high up, which suggests that he doesn't want anyone to see in. So we're starting to link together some of these key themes. Okay, so let's get reading. It is only quite a short chapter, so that's quite significant in itself, which suggests that the shorter the chapter, the more significant the particular events are, because Stevenson wants to draw our attention to them. Okay, just to remind you, chapter 6 ended with the death of Dr. Lanyon. So we've ended on quite a dark note, but just notice the way that the chapter begins, because it starts actually on quite a positive note, and just think about the way that Stevenson is constantly changing the mood and tone. So the incident at the window. It chanced on Sunday, when Mr. Utterson was on his usual walk with Mr. Enfield, that their way lay once again through the by-street, and that when they came in front of the door, both stopped to gaze on it. "Well," said Enfield, "that story's at an end at least. We shall never see more of Hyde." "I hope not," said Mr. Utterson. "Did I ever tell you that I once saw him and shared your feelings of repulsion?" Now, it's significant that we begin this chapter with Utterson and Enfield once again, because if you remember, the book began with Utterson and Enfield on one of their walks, and it's only the second time in the book that we do get to see Enfield, and in fact, the final time that we do, which gives the narrative almost a cyclical feel, as though perhaps we're beginning the book with Enfield and Utterson, and now we're ending it with Utterson and Enfield outside the same door, obviously, which the door that we know to be the back entrance to Dr. Jekyll's house. And there's a real feeling of optimism here, because they're talking about the fact that we shall never see more of Hyde. The story's at an end at least, and it gives them a false sense of security, because they feel that that Mr. Hyde has perhaps disappeared forever. But of course, we know that this, as a reader, we know that this is only chapter 7 out of 10. So the implication for us as the reader would be that this story is far from over just yet. "It was impossible to do the one without the other," returned Enfield. "And by the way, what an ass you must have thought me, not to know that this was the back way to Dr. Jekyll's. It was partly your own fault that I found it out when I did." "So you found it out, did you?" said Utterson. "But if that be so, we may step into the court and take a look at the windows. To tell you the truth, I'm uneasy about poor Jekyll, and even outside I feel as if the presence of a friend might do him good." Now, this idea of Utterson referring to Dr. Jekyll as a friend still is significant, because if you remember at the end of chapter 6, he kind of withdrawn a bit from Dr. Jekyll because of the association with Lanyon's death. Of course, don't forget that Utterson doesn't know what happened to Lanyon yet. All he knows is that the three of them had become close friends again for several months. We, as the reader, later find out that that's because he was trying to appease for the murder of Sir Danvers Carew, and of course we know later on, we discover that the reason why he's kept away from people again now is because he can no longer control when he turns into Mr. Hyde. He doesn't have to take the potion anymore. His body is doing so involuntarily, because the evil within Dr. Jekyll's brain has grown to a point that he can no longer contain it. It's also significant because if you remember at the start of the chapter, the start of the book, at the start of chapter 1, it referred to Mr. Utterson as being the last person that a man often had in his going down. In other words, he was often the person who would stand by his friends, even at their worst time of need. And we can see here that even though he's tried to distance himself a little bit from Dr. Jekyll, he's actually prepared to go and see him again now, because he realises this is somebody that does really need some help. The court was very cool and a little damp, and full of premature twilight, although the sky high up overhead was still bright with sunset. The middle one of the 3 windows was halfway open, and sitting close beside it, taking the air with an infinite sadness of mien, like some disconsolate prisoner, Utterson saw Dr. Jekyll. Now, I think it's important that we think about the idea of windows, because as we've discussed before, the the eyes were considered to be the windows to the soul. And so we've had a building here that we've described as having either no windows or very small windows. And it links to the idea that perhaps Dr. Jekyll is becoming soulless almost. And it also implies that he's trying to hide something. And we know that's because he's trying to hide what he's doing with taking the potion, turning into Mr. Hyde. It's also interesting to note that Utterson refers to Dr. Jekyll as being like some disconsolate prisoner, and it's the idea that not only is he trapped inside his house because he can't risk turning into Mr. Hyde outside of the home, because of course if he were to get caught he would undoubtedly be executed for the murder of Sir Danvers Carew, but it's also the idea that Dr. Jekyll is almost like a prisoner within the body of Mr. Hyde now, because it's Mr. Hyde that's doing that's controlling Dr. Jekyll rather than the other way round. What, Jekyll? He cried. I trust you are better. I'm very low, Utterson, replied the doctor drearily. Very low. It will not last long, thank God. You stay too much indoors, said the lawyer. You should be out, whipping up the circulation like Mr. Enfield and me. This is my cousin, Mr. Enfield, Dr. Jekyll. Come now, get your hat and take a quick turn with us. You are very good, sighed the other. I should like very much, but no. It's quite impossible. I dare not. But indeed, Utterson, I am very glad to see you. This really is a great pleasure. I would ask you and Mr. Enfield up, but the place is really not fit. Now, we need to return at this point to some element of the context, and that's the fact that as Victorian gentlemen, there will be a significant expectation in terms of their behaviour. We've discussed this quite a lot in class, and we can see here the belief that obviously they should be walking, they should be going out walking, because that was the way that they would sort of show passers-by their status. But it's also the fact that Mr. Utterson looks out for his friend as well. And so there's a significance behind that as well. Why then, said the lawyer good-naturedly, the best thing we can do is to stay down here and speak with you from where you are. That is just what I was about to venture to propose, returned the doctor with a smile. But the words were hardly uttered before the smile was struck out of his face and succeeded by an expression of such abject terror and despair as froze the very blood of the two gentlemen below. They saw it but for a glimpse, for the window was instantly thrust down. But that glimpse had been sufficient, and they turned and left the court without a word. In silence, too, they traversed the by-street, and it was not until they had come into a neighbouring thoroughfare, where, even upon a Sunday, there was still some stirrings of life, that Mr. Utterson at last turned and looked at his companion. They were both pale, and there was an answering horror in their eyes. God forgive us, said Mr. Utterson. But Mr. Enfield only nodded his head very seriously and walked on once more in silence. Now, at this point here, because it's told from third-person narrative, we don't quite know what Utterson and Enfield see at that point. However, the fact that it's described as Jekyll's face as being succeeded by an expression of such abject terror and despair as froze the very blood of the two gentlemen below suggests that they've seen something really quite horrific and quite emotive for them. If you look at the semantic field of language, we've got things like terror, despair, horror, which suggests that whatever happens and whatever they witness is something very, very unpleasant. As I've already said earlier, we need to remember that these are Victorian gentlemen who would be expected to deal with things in quite a stoic, quite a gentlemanly, quite a strong kind of way. And the fact that it describes them both as pale, and it also repeats the use of the word silence in their response, shows that this is something that they really are struggling to comprehend. It's also interesting to note that Utterson says, God forgive us, because, of course, we need to remember how significant religion was at this time, and the fact that they've obviously seen something that's almost quite hellish because they're asking God's forgiveness for the things that they've just seen. Now, we've seen previously in the book that Mr. Hyde, is repeatedly referred to as some kind of devil or in some kind of satanic way. And so we've got these two opposites here of the idea of heaven and hell, and the fact that the two men, when they see it, Utterson and Enfield, automatically turn their thoughts to God as some kind of perhaps protection for what they've just seen. But either way, the fact that they don't realise at this point that they're perhaps seeing Jekyll turning to Hyde for the first time. But whatever they've seen has left a very, very bad impression on them. And I think it's quite notable that the two gentlemen don't actually talk about it, but they know that they've both seen something really quite horrific. I mean, the fact that the chapter ends with they walked on once more in silence shows that this is something they almost either that they can't speak about or they don't need to speak about because they've both seen the same thing. Okay, right. So just to summarise, then, this is a short chapter, and it starts. It obviously starts on quite a positive because Utterson and Enfield believe that there's an end to the story, that Hyde has disappeared. But of course, we as the reader know that that can't be the case because the book is quite significantly longer. And in terms of Victorian text, a Gothic text, we the writers at the time would not allow the perpetrator, in this case Hyde, to not be caught in some way and for them not to be a resolution, because the Victorian readers would find that really quite horrific, that there was no end to it, no tie up, no certainty of Hyde's death, rather than just the disappearance that we've seen already. Okay. It's significant that we return to Utterson and Enfield because they began the book, and in some ways it does give us this feeling of a cycle of the narrative coming full circle, but of course we know that that's not the case. It allows briefly for the book to have an uplifting tone because, as I said, that the two gentlemen believe that this is all over. But then if you look at the language that's used to describe what they see, we've got this very, very dark and very terrifying semantic field with words like horror and terror and despair. Those words there suggest that when Dr. Jekyll turns into Mr. Hyde, this isn't a positive feeling anymore. This isn't something that he enjoys. It's something that he can't stop, and something that obviously causes him great pain and distress, and something that he doesn't want to do. And it's worth remembering as well that, of course, he can't let other people see him turn into Hyde, because if he were to be caught, he would be hanged for the murder of Danvers Curran. Okay, see you next time for Chapter 8. Bye.